There's a particular kind of arrogance that only reveals itself in hindsight, and nowhere is it more visible than in the case of a man who spent 3 decades teaching every soldier under his command never to say anything of value near a telephone, never to trust a social club, never to assume a room was safe, and who then proceeded to stand in that same room, night after night, in an apartment 2 floors above, a storefront in Little Italy, and describe murders, payoffs, and the entire management structure of the largest criminal organization in New York City in his own voice, for federal agents to record at their leisure, transcribe at their leisure, and eventually play back to a jury at their leisure? The man was John Gotti. For nearly 7 years, from the moment he seized control of the Gambino crime family in the winter of 1985 to the moment federal agents let him out of a Little Italy social club in handcuffs in the winter of 1990, he was the most photographed, most quoted, and most recognizable organized crime figure in the United States. He wore hand-tailored suits that cost more than most of his associates earned in a month. He held court for reporters on the courthouse steps. He was acquitted 3 times in 3 separate trials, and each acquittal built the legend a little further, until the newspapers gave him a nickname that would follow him to his grave. The Teflon Don, the man nothing could stick to. What nothing could stick to, in the end, was not the truth. It was simply patience. Behind the tailored suits and the courthouse press conferences, federal investigators had spent years trying to find a way inside the organization Gotti ran, and every conventional method had failed. So they tried something almost absurdly simple. They found the room where he actually did his talking, and they listened. What they captured over hundreds of hours of tape was a man so convinced of his own invincibility that he forgot the first rule he had spent his career enforcing on everyone around him. This is the story of how John Gotti built an empire on discipline and secrecy and lost it to his own mouth. Drop where you are watching this from in the comments below. It genuinely makes my day to see it. And if you're new here and want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. Now, back to that room above the social club and the tapes that were quietly running the whole time. John Joseph Gotti was born on October 27th, 1940, in the South Bronx, the fifth of 13 children born to John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Philomena, known to everyone as Fanny. 2 of the 13 children died in infancy. His father worked irregularly as a day laborer, when he worked at all, and what money came into the household was frequently lost to gambling before it ever reached the family's needs. Gotti would later tell his own underboss that his father never provided for the family, never earned anything worth mentioning, and that the household had nothing to show for his father's decades of labor. Whatever affection existed between father and son, it did not survive Gotti's adult recollection of his own childhood, which he described to intimates in terms of simple resentment. By the time the family had settled in East New York, Brooklyn, John Gotti was already spending his afternoons on the street rather than at home, and by the age of 12, he was running errands for a local crime figure named Carmine Fatico, a captain in the Gambino organization who controlled rackets throughout Ozone Park, Queens. It was a small entry point, the kind available to any neighborhood boy willing to make himself useful, but it placed Gotti inside a network that would define the rest of his life. Through Fatico's orbit, Gotti was introduced to a man named Aniello Dellacroce, the Gambino family's underboss, a relationship that would shape Gotti more than any other in his criminal career. Before any of that patronage mattered, there was simply the street. Gotti became the leader of a gang called the Fulton-Rockaway Boys, a loosely organized group of neighborhood teenagers whose activities ran toward fighting, theft, and the kind of low-grade disorder that police departments rarely bother to prosecute seriously. At 14, attempting to steal a cement mixer from a construction site, Gotti caused the machine to fall on him, crushing his toes and leaving him with a limp that stayed with him for the rest of his life, along with an early and permanent introduction to consequence. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at 16, already known there as a bully and a chronic truant, and he never returned to any form of formal education. The neighborhood itself provided the rest of his curriculum. East New York in the 1950s was a dense, working-class corner of Brooklyn, thick with the kind of organized crime infrastructure that had existed there for a generation, part of a citywide network of 5 interlocking criminal organizations known collectively as the Five Families that had divided New York's underworld among themselves since the 1930s and governed disputes between one another through a shared body called the Commission. The Gambino family, the one whose name Fatico's crew ultimately answered to, was at that time led by a cautious, soft-spoken boss named Carlo Gambino, a man who had built the largest and most disciplined of the 5 organizations by avoiding exactly the kind of publicity and violence that would later define Gotti's own career. A boy with Gotti's temperament, physical toughness, and willingness to follow instructions without asking too many questions was exactly the raw material the Gambino family's street-level operations were built on. He did not need to seek the life out. It surrounded him from childhood, and it absorbed him the way it had absorbed hundreds of young men from the same blocks before him. In 1958, at 18 years old, Gotti met a young woman named Victoria Di Giorgio at a neighborhood bar. She was of half Italian and half Russian descent, raised largely by a stepfather after her parents divorced when she was still an infant, and she dropped out of high school during her own senior year. Around the same period, Gotti was abandoning any pretense of formal education himself. The two married on March 6, 1962, and would eventually have 5 children together, though the marriage itself was, by nearly every account from people who knew the household, a stormy one, marked by long separations and frequent arguments that did nothing to interrupt the couple's decades together. Their relationship, like nearly everything else in Gotti's early adult life, moved forward against a backdrop of arrests, brief attempts at legitimate work, and a slow but steady deepening of his ties to organized crime. He tried his hand at honest employment twice, once as a presser in a coat factory, and once as an assistant truck driver, and neither lasted. The truck driving work, ironically, put him in direct proximity to the cargo operations at what was then called Idlewild Airport, soon to be renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport, and it was there that Gotti found his first real criminal specialty: hijacking. Working alongside his brother Gene and his close friend Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti spent much of the 1960s stealing truckloads of merchandise from the cargo areas surrounding the airport, targeting shipments of everything from electronics to women's clothing that could be quickly resold through a network of fences scattered across Brooklyn and Queens. It was unglamorous, repetitive criminal labor, the kind that built no legend and generated no headlines, but it built something more useful to a young man trying to establish himself inside an organization: a reputation for reliability. In 1968, that reputation nearly cost him everything when federal agents arrested him for a hijacking involving stolen merchandise from a forwarding company at Kennedy Airport, a theft carried out using a forged signature to walk a rented truck straight out of the cargo terminal in broad daylight. He was arrested again shortly after, this time for a separate hijacking on the New Jersey Turnpike, while he was still out on bail from the first charge, a decision that suggested either supreme confidence or a simple inability to stop. He was sentenced to a term at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, and served roughly 3 years before his release. Gotti returned in 1972 to the same crew he had left, now operating out of a storefront social club in Ozone Park called the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club, a name chosen specifically because it sounded like a harmless community organization rather than what it actually was. Fatico, the captain who had first brought Gotti into the fold as a child, was now facing his own loan-sharking indictment, and as a condition of his bail, he was barred from associating with known felons. With Fatico sidelined, the day-to-day management of the Bergin crew fell to Gotti, who was named acting captain in his early 30s. Despite not yet being a formally initiated member of the family, the Gambino membership books had been closed since a 1957 summit meeting in Appalachian, New York, that had drawn unwanted police attention to the entire national organization, and no new members had been permitted in for the better part of 2 decades. What followed was the act that would finally earn Gotti his formal induction. In May of 1973, a small-time Irish-American gangster named James McBratney had been involved in the kidnapping and killing of a nephew of Carlo Gambino himself, the family's aging boss. Gotti was among those sent to settle the matter, and the settlement was violent and public enough that multiple bystanders were later able to identify him. He was arrested the following year. The historical record differs on exactly how long Gotti spent behind bars for the McBratney killing, with some accounts describing a 2-year sentence and others describing 4, but what is not disputed is the outcome. Gotti pleaded to a reduced charge of attempted manslaughter, served his time, and emerged from prison in 1977, not as a man under suspicion, but as a man who had proven decisively that he could be trusted with violence and would not talk about it afterward. That trust was rewarded immediately. Gambino's membership books had reopened by then, and Gotti was formally initiated as a made member of the family, then almost immediately elevated to captain of the Bergin crew, replacing DeCicco outright. He was, by every account from that period, Dellacroce's protege above all others, and the Bergin crew under his command became the underboss's most productive earners, running loan sharking operations, illegal gambling, and, according to persistent but never fully confirmed FBI intelligence, financing narcotics deals that the family's official policy strictly forbade. In December of 1978, Gotti played a supporting role in the Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport, at the time the largest unrecovered cash robbery in American history, arranging for the getaway vehicle to be crushed and disposed of at a Brooklyn scrapyard. His reported cut of the proceeds was $200,000. Personal tragedy arrived in March of 1980 when Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank was struck and killed by a car driven by a neighbor named John Favara after the boy rode his minibike into traffic. The death was ruled an accident by investigators, but the Gotti household did not treat it as one. Victoria DiGiorgio reportedly attacked Favara with a baseball bat sometime after the incident. Favara endured months of threats and was eventually abducted in July of that year and never seen again, despite having moved his own family out of state in the weeks before his disappearance in an attempt to escape exactly the fate that found him anyway. No one was ever charged in the case for decades, and the precise details of what happened to him were never established through any conviction, though accounts that surfaced years later from cooperating witnesses described his body being disposed of with a level of thoroughness meant to guarantee it would never be recovered, including one allegation raised in federal court papers filed more than 2 decades afterward that a Gambino associate had dissolved his remains in acid. Gotti himself was on a family vacation in Florida at the time of the abduction, a piece of timing few investigators who studied the case ever mistook for coincidence. By the early 1980s, the Gambino family had effectively split into 2 competing philosophies of how organized crime should be run, and the split ran directly through the middle of Gotti's own career. One faction, aligned with Dellacroce and operating largely out of the outer boroughs, believed in the traditional street rackets that had built the American Mafia in the first place: gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, extortion, and, for those willing to risk it, narcotics. The other faction, aligned with Castellano and drawing much of its wealth from Manhattan's garment district, believed in laundering the family's money into something closer to legitimate enterprise, controlling trucking companies that move finished clothing between manufacturers and warehouses, skimming a percentage off every shipment that passed through mob-controlled routes, and treating construction and labor union corruption as a business to be carefully managed rather than a war to be fought in the streets. Castellano wanted the family to look from the outside like something other than what it was. Dellacroce's crews, including Gotti's, wanted no part of that transformation and feared, correctly as it turned out, that a fully legitimized family would eventually have no place left for men whose only real skill was violence. The tension that would eventually reshape the entire Gambino family was quietly building at a level above Gotti's own crew in the relationship between Castellano and the underboss who had mentored Gotti from childhood. Castellano had inherited leadership of the family in 1976 upon the death of Carlo Gambino, who had chosen his brother-in-law over Dellacroce for reasons that were never entirely explained, but were widely believed to reflect Gambino's preference for a boss oriented toward legitimate-seeming business rather than street violence. Castellano ran construction rackets, meat distribution, and labor union corruption with the polish of a businessman, kept himself largely isolated in a mansion on Staten Island, and had little patience for the old-fashioned street earners who made up crews like Gotti's. He was also, unlike Dellacroce, adamantly and publicly opposed to narcotics trafficking within the family, a policy that put him on a direct collision course with men like Gotti's close friend Aniello Ruggiero, a talkative, restless associate whose habit of never shutting up had earned him the nickname Quack Quack among his own colleagues, a nickname that would prove to be one of the great unintentional prophecies in the entire history of the family. That collision arrived in the form of federal wiretaps. Unbeknownst to Ruggiero, federal agents had been listening to his home telephone since 1980, and by the middle of the decade, they had captured him discussing narcotics deals in explicit detail, a direct violation of Castellano's standing order that dealing meant death, along with a running commentary of contemptuous remarks about Castellano himself, dismissing the boss in terms no soldier was ever supposed to use about the man at the top of the organization. By law, a defendant charged on the basis of wiretap evidence has to be given transcripts of the recordings to prepare his defense, and once Ruggiero received his boxes of transcripts from a related 1983 narcotics indictment that had also swept up Gotti's brother Gene and a dozen other Gambino associates, word reached Castellano that the tapes existed and that they discussed him directly. He wanted them. When Castellano demanded that Dellacroce turn the transcripts over, Dellacroce refused and simply stalled through the rest of 1984 and into 1985, protecting his own crew rather than exposing them to the boss's wrath. Castellano's patience did not last forever. By late 1985, with his own racketeering trial approaching, he had reportedly begun telling members of his inner circle that if the transcripts were not produced soon, he would have both Ruggiero and Gotti killed. The pressure did not come from Castellano alone. That same broad narcotics case indicted 13 members and associates of the Gambino family, Gene Gotti and Aniello Ruggiero, prominent among them, and the resulting heroin trial dragged on for years, in part because the Gambino family worked to compromise the jury pool, producing 2 separate mistrials before prosecutors finally secured a conviction. Gene Gotti would eventually serve close to 3 decades in federal custody on the strength of that case, a fact that did nothing to soften John Gotti's own contempt for Castellano's drug policy, since in Gotti's calculation the danger to his brother and his crew came not from the narcotics itself, but from a boss who seemed willing to let them all be killed over it, rather than defend them. The indictment that swept up Ruggiero and Gene Gotti was not the only one closing in on the Bergin crew that year. In 1985, Gotti himself was indicted alongside Dellacroce and several other crew members in a separate, broader racketeering case brought by federal prosecutor Diane Giacalone. The indictment also revealed that a longtime Gotti associate named Wilfred Johnson had been a federal informant for years, a discovery that deepened the paranoia running through the entire organization and left every man in the Bergin crew wondering, for the first time in a serious and personal way, who among his closest friends might already be reporting to the government. Even the smaller cases pending against Gotti at the time carried the same undertone of witness pressure that would define his entire legal career. The assault and robbery charge, stemming from his 1984 altercation with a refrigerator mechanic named Romuald Piszek, was still working its way toward trial when Giacalone, citing evidence that the family had intimidated witnesses connected to that very case, successfully moved to have Gotti's bail revoked, a preview of exactly the kind of interference that would follow the Gambino family into every courtroom it entered for the rest of the decade. Then, on December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died of cancer, and the fragile balance holding the Gambino family together died with him. Castellano did not attend the wake, citing his own ongoing legal troubles, and a desire to avoid further exposure to law enforcement surveillance, and the absence was received by Dellacroce's loyalists, Gotti chief among them, as an unforgivable insult. Castellano compounded the injury by naming his own bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, a man with little standing among the family's veteran captains, as the new underboss, and by signaling that he intended to eventually break up Gotti's Bergin crew altogether. For Gotti, who had spent years fearing that Castellano's zero-tolerance drug policy would eventually be turned against him and his brother Gene, the combination of insult and existential threat left, in his own assessment, no path forward except Castellano's removal. The killing took place on the evening of December the 16th, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, where Castellano and Bellotti had arrived for a meeting arranged in part through a captain named Frank DeCicco, who had quietly aligned himself with the conspirators against his own boss. A team of gunmen, dressed in matching trench coats and fur hats to disguise their appearance in the crowded early evening street, positioned themselves outside the restaurant's entrance. Gotti and his associate Salvatore Gravano waited nearby in a car with tinted windows, monitoring the scene by walkie-talkie. When Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up to the curb, Gotti gave the order. As Castellano stepped from the passenger side, the gunmen opened fire, striking him 6 times and killing him instantly. Bellotti, attempting to exit the driver's side and reach for a weapon, was shot 4 times and killed as well. The entire operation lasted under 2 minutes, in full view of the dinner-hour crowds on one of Manhattan's busiest streets, and the shooters simply walked off and disappeared into the pedestrian traffic. Gotti and Gravano drove slowly past the bodies afterward to confirm both men were dead before making their exit. The retaliation for that violation of protocol arrived within months, and it very nearly killed Gotti before his reign as boss had properly begun. The murder of a sitting boss without the commission's approval was a breach of Mafia governance that dated back decades, and Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family and a longtime business partner of Castellano's, treated the unsanctioned killing as an offense the commission could not simply overlook. Gigante arranged for the Lucchese family's leadership to handle the matter, and on April 13th, 1986, an explosives device was planted beneath the car belonging to Gotti's newly appointed underboss, Frank DeCicco, parked outside a social club in the Dyker Heights section of Brooklyn, where Gotti and DeCicco were both scheduled to attend a meeting that afternoon. Gotti canceled his own visit to the club at the last minute for reasons that were never fully explained. DeCicco did not. When DeCicco walked to his car alongside a Lucchese soldier who happened to bear a passing resemblance to Gotti, the bomb was detonated, killing DeCicco instantly and severely wounding the other man. Gotti, the actual target, was somewhere else entirely, and never learned how close the plot had come to succeeding until years later, when a cooperating witness inside the Lucchese family finally described it to federal investigators. What Gotti had eliminated with 6 bullets and 4 bullets, he now had to justify to an organization that had never sanctioned the killing of a sitting boss without approval from the Commission, the governing body of New York's 5 families. He did not wait for permission or forgiveness. Within days, Gotti had positioned himself as the new head of the Gambino family, the largest and by most estimates, the wealthiest of the 5, and the men who might have objected found themselves either persuaded, sidelined, or simply too far behind the momentum of events to resist. Gravano was elevated to captain almost immediately, and would climb steadily through the ranks over the following years, first to consigliere in 1987 and then to underboss in 1988, remaining at Gotti's side through everything that followed. Gravano had been born in Brooklyn's Bensonhurst neighborhood in 1945 and had earned his own nickname, the Bull, not from any particular act of violence, but simply because a relative once remarked that he resembled his Uncle Sammy. Whatever the origin of the nickname, the reputation that followed it was earned honestly. By the time he became underboss, Gravano had participated, by his own later admission, in a substantial share of the murders that had quietly shaped the Gambino family's internal order over the preceding 2 decades, and he brought to the position a cold, businesslike efficiency that made him, in the estimation of nearly everyone who dealt with him, the single most capable operator beneath Gotti in the entire organization. What Gotti built once he held the position Castellano had occupied was, in almost every visible respect, the exact opposite of what Castellano had built. Where Castellano had isolated himself in a Staten Island mansion, Gotti held court publicly, dining at expensive Manhattan restaurants, greeting well-wishers on the street, and expecting his captains to appear before him weekly at his new headquarters, the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, a demand for visible deference that many of his own men privately resented, since it meant lining up outside a storefront under the exact conditions federal surveillance teams found easiest to photograph. Where Castellano had worn the drab suits of a man trying not to be noticed, Gotti wore custom-tailored double-breasted suits reported to cost thousands of dollars each, and the press, delighted by the contrast, gave him the nickname the Dapper Don. He was estimated to earn somewhere between $5 million and $20 million a year in his position atop the family, a range wide enough that even federal investigators could not settle on a precise figure, though every account agreed the sums were enormous. Those closest to Gotti in this period described a man who treated his own appearance with something close to ceremony. He was reported to spend heavily on grooming and wardrobe, favoring hand-painted silk neckties and suits from an Italian design house, and he maintained a gambling habit that, according to one associate who had known him since childhood, could run to bets of $100,000 in a single week, a detail that fits uneasily alongside the disciplined, controlled image Gotti otherwise tried to project. Where Castellano had wanted his organization to disappear into the appearance of ordinary business, Gotti seemed to want the opposite, to be recognized, admired, and photographed, treating the risk of exposure less as a danger to be minimized than as a kind of proof of his own untouchability. The money that flowed to Gotti came from an empire built largely by the very white-collar operations his own faction had once resented under Castellano, an irony Gotti himself never seemed to dwell on once he was the one collecting the proceeds. A captain named Thomas Gambino, who had wisely pledged his loyalty to the new boss within days of Castellano's murder, controlled a network of trucking companies that dominated deliveries throughout Manhattan's garment district, charging shipping rates estimated at 40% above what non-mob competitors could offer, and quietly imposing what amounted to a tax on nearly every finished garment moved between manufacturers, contractors, and warehouses across the city. Other crews controlled construction industry extortion, forcing contractors to pay for labor peace and material deliveries whether they wanted the services or not, along with waste hauling, the piers and cargo terminals surrounding Kennedy Airport, and a sprawling network of illegal gambling and loan sharking operations that reached from Manhattan out through Queens, Brooklyn, and into New Jersey. Layered beneath all of it was a set of relationships with construction and trucking unions that gave the family influence over who worked, who got promoted, and whose businesses survived contact with organized labor in New York City, an inheritance from Carlo Gambino's own decades of quiet labor, racketeering that Gotti now controlled without ever having built any of it himself. Gotti's rise to power happened to coincide almost exactly with a broader shift already underway in how the federal government approached organized crime as a whole. Between 1985 and 1987, a separate and sweeping prosecution known as the Commission Trial had used the same racketeering statute to convict 8 leaders from 3 of New York's other crime families, treating the commission itself, the governing body that set policy across all 5 organizations, as a single ongoing criminal conspiracy. That prosecution proved the underlying legal theory could work against the very highest levels of Mafia leadership, and it left federal prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan with every incentive to apply the same approach to Gotti, whose flamboyant public profile made him a more visible and more politically valuable target than almost any other boss in the country. The publicity that made Gotti famous also made him the single most closely watched organized crime figure in the country, and the federal government's first serious attempt to convict him arrived in 1986 when prosecutor Diane Giacalone brought a sweeping racketeering case against him and several co-defendants. The trial, which stretched into 1987, seemed on paper to be exactly the kind of case that should have ended Gotti's career. It did not. A juror named George Papp had been paid $60,000, delivered in 3 installments of $20,000 each, told out for acquittal and pressure the rest of the panel, and on March 13, 1987, the jury acquitted Gotti and his co-defendants of every charge. The scheme would not be exposed and prosecuted until years later, but at the time, the verdict was received by the public as a stunning defeat for federal prosecutors and cemented Gotti's reputation as untouchable. The theater of that first trial did as much for Gotti's reputation as the verdict itself, and it drew crowds of its own long before the case ever reached a jury. Reporters covering the proceedings each morning described a scene closer to a celebrity trial than a routine racketeering case, with photographers jostling for position outside the courthouse and Gotti himself, dressed each day in a different tailored suit, pausing on the steps to offer brief, quotable remarks before disappearing inside. His lead attorney, a combative courtroom performer named Bruce Cutler, built a defense strategy around sheer aggression, badgering government witnesses and painting the prosecution's entire case as a vendetta against his client, rather than a legitimate inquiry into organized crime. At one point, the defense called a bank robber named Matthew Traynor, a witness the prosecution itself had dropped for unreliability, who testified under oath that the lead prosecutor had offered him drugs and her own undergarments as an incentive to provide false testimony against Gotti. The presiding judge would later dismiss the allegation outright as entirely unbelievable, and Traynor himself was subsequently convicted of perjury for it. But the accusation had already done its work in front of the jury and in the next morning's newspapers. According to the writers who later reconstructed the jury's private deliberations, a majority of the panel had actually been prepared to convict Gotti before the corrupted juror, a man named George Pape, began steering the rest of the group toward acquittal, first through argument and eventually, as deliberations wore on, through an atmosphere of implied threat that left several jurors more concerned with their own safety than with the strength of the government's evidence. Among Gotti's co-defendants in that same trial sat a longtime associate named Wilfred Johnson, known on the street as Willie Boy, a man of mixed Italian and Native American descent who had been running with Gotti's crew since the two were teenagers in East New York. What almost none of the defendants knew, and what prosecutor Diane Giacalone revealed in open court in an effort to pressure him into cooperating, was that Johnson had been feeding information to the FBI since 1966, information that had touched on Gotti's activities for the better part of 2 decades. Johnson refused the government's offer of witness protection, denied publicly that he had ever been an informant, and declined to testify against Gotti even after his cover had been permanently blown, a decision that, by some accounts, briefly earned him an understanding from Gotti that his life would be spared as long as he stayed silent and stayed away from the family's affairs going forward. That understanding did not survive contact with the more complete information. On August 29, 1988, roughly a year and a half after the acquittal his silence had helped secure, gunmen ambushed Johnson outside his own Brooklyn home as he walked to his car, firing 19 rounds into him at close range. He was hit in both thighs, struck twice in the back, and shot at least 6 times in the head. Whatever the precise calculation that led to the timing of the murder, the lesson it delivered to everyone else in the organization was unambiguous. Silence, even total and consistently maintained silence, was ultimately no guarantee of safety once the government had already exposed you as a source. It was a lesson about the danger of being overheard that the entire Gambino family absorbed instantly and completely, and that its own boss would spend the next several years failing to apply to himself in the one room where it mattered most. A second trial followed in February of 1990, this time in state court, concerning the shooting of a union official named John O'Connor. Prosecutors had a recording of Gotti discussing O'Connor and stating his intention to have him beaten, along with testimony from a member of a separate Manhattan gang who claimed direct knowledge of the plot, but the same witness who had originally identified Gotti before a grand jury developed a sudden and convenient inability to remember the attack at all once he took the stand at trial. Gotti was acquitted on all 6 charges on February 9th, 1990, and that evening residents in his own neighborhood set off fireworks in celebration, as though a beloved local figure had won a championship rather than walked free from a shooting charge. The head of the FBI's Organized Crime Division in New York, exasperated by the celebratory coverage, complained publicly that the media had begun treating a violent criminal boss surrounded by killers as something close to a folk hero, a complaint that did nothing to slow the momentum of Gotti's growing legend. It later emerged that the same FBI recordings capturing Gotti's role in the O'Connor beating had also captured him discussing plans to fix that jury in almost exactly the manner that had already worked once before, though federal prosecutors, to the fury of the state officials handling the case, chose not to share that particular piece of intelligence before the verdict came in. 2 acquittals within 3 years, both later revealed to rest on witness intimidation and jury corruption rather than genuine innocence, were enough for the American press to coin the label that would follow Gotti for the rest of his life: the Teflon Don, a boss against whom nothing, it seemed, could ever be made to stick. What the public did not know, and what Gotti himself seemed unable to fully internalize despite 3 decades in an industry built on the assumption that the government was always listening, was that federal investigators had spent the better part of the 1980s trying to find a location where Gotti actually spoke freely and had settled on the Ravenite as the obvious candidate. The problem, once agents attempted to bug the club itself, was almost comically mundane. The acoustics were terrible: a hissing espresso machine, a rattling soda machine, and the overlapping noise of dozens of simultaneous conversations rendered most recordings from inside the storefront nearly useless. Gotti's own caution compounded the problem. He rarely discussed anything of substance inside the main room of the club at all. By the time federal agents turned their full attention to the apartment above the Ravenite, they were, in a very real sense, simply waiting for Gotti to do what he had already shown across 2 acquittals and a decade of increasingly public living that he could not help doing: talk. Every other tool the government had tried against him, informants, undercover operatives, financial investigations, had run into the same wall that had protected organized crime bosses for generations: the absence of a cooperating witness willing to testify from inside the room where decisions were actually made. What the Bureau needed was not more evidence of what Gotti's organization did. It already had plenty of that. What it needed was Gotti's own voice, connecting himself personally and directly to the decisions his crews carried out, and the surest way to get that voice on tape was to find wherever he felt safe enough to stop performing. This was not the first time federal agents had tried to listen in on Gotti's world. As early as 1981, investigators had installed surveillance equipment at the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, the storefront where Gotti had cut his teeth as acting captain years earlier, hoping to capture the same kind of unguarded conversation that would eventually doom him at the Ravenite. That earlier effort produced years of raw intelligence about the crew's structure and habits, but never delivered the kind of direct, prosecutable admissions the government needed, and by the time Gotti had relocated his operations to Manhattan as boss, the Bureau understood it would need a location closer to the center of power itself. The Ravenite, as the new hub of Gambino authority, was the obvious next target, and Bruce Mao, the agent supervising the Gambino squad, treated finding a way inside it as the central problem of his career. An informant eventually gave the investigators the break they needed, reporting that Gotti sometimes left the Ravenite through a side door into the building's first-floor hallway to speak privately with his captains, and that he also, on occasion, went upstairs to an apartment rented by a widow named Nettie Sorelli, whose late husband had been a Gambino family associate. The same apartment, it turned out, had once been used for private meetings by Dellacroce himself. Over the Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, with Sorelli away in Florida, an FBI surveillance team quietly entered the apartment and installed a listening device. What followed between late November of 1989 and the following spring was the most productive electronic surveillance operation the Bureau had ever run against Gotti, ultimately capturing roughly 600 hours of recorded conversation. The tapes captured a version of John Gotti that no reporter, no courthouse crowd, and no captain forced to line up outside the Ravenite each week had ever been permitted to see, unguarded, expansive, and startlingly indiscreet about the exact operational details his entire criminal education should have taught him to conceal. On a recording made on December 12, 1989, Gotti can be heard discussing his intentions regarding an associate named Louis De Bono, a Gambino soldier who had repeatedly failed to show up for meetings Gotti had summoned him to, an offense Gotti treated on tape as a serious breach of respect rather than a minor scheduling problem. Roughly 10 months later, on October 4th, 1990, De Bono was shot to death in a parking garage beneath the former World Trade Center, killed, according to the government's later account, on Gotti's direct orders and for exactly the reason he had already described on tape the previous December. The recording did not merely implicate Gotti after the fact. It had captured him announcing his intentions before the killing ever took place, a piece of evidence no prosecutor could have hoped to manufacture and no defendant should ever have allowed to exist. The gunman who carried out the De Bono killing, a Gambino soldier named John Carneglia, was not formally convicted for that specific murder until years later, when a 1993 indictment charged him with the killing, and a jury sentenced him in the fall of 1994 to 10 years in federal prison, along with a fine of $250,000, one more thread in the enormous web of prosecutions that Gotti's own tapes had helped set in motion against men who had never personally stood anywhere near the Sorelli apartment. On other recordings from the same stretch of tapes, Gotti addresses the question of succession directly, telling those present that if he were ever imprisoned for an extended stretch, Gravano would run the operation in his place, a level of organizational transparency that no defense attorney would ever have advised a client under active federal suspicion to commit to tape. The single most remarkable moment on the entire 600 hours arrived almost as a piece of dark comedy. Gotti can be heard on one recording explicitly warning the men around him about the danger of being bugged, lecturing them on the discipline required to avoid federal surveillance, before acknowledging aloud, apparently without any sense of the irony involved, that he himself was probably the worst offender in the entire organization when it came to ignoring that exact advice. The man who had built an entire operational culture around the assumption that the government was always listening had just confirmed, in his own recorded voice, that he understood the danger perfectly and had simply chosen not to protect himself from it. When prosecutors played that recording back to him years later in open court, Gotti reportedly laughed. For Mao, the operation represented the culmination of a career spent almost entirely focused on one target. He had led the Gambino squad since the early 1980s, had watched Gotti walk free from two separate trials, and had absorbed, along with every other agent assigned to the case, the particular institutional frustration of knowing a man was guilty of an enormous range of crimes while lacking the specific admissible proof a jury would ever be permitted to hear. The tapes from the Sorelli apartment did not merely add to that body of knowledge, they transformed it, for the first time, into something a courtroom could actually use. The recordings accumulated for months before federal agents moved. On the night of December 11th, 1990, a surveillance supervisor named Bruce Mao watched through binoculars as agents and New York City police detectives converged on the Ravenite and arrested Gotti, along with Gravano and a captain named Frank DeCicco, on a sweeping set of racketeering charges. A superseding indictment returned in July of 1991 expanded the case to 13 counts, formally charging Gotti in 5 murders, Castellano and Bellotti from the Sparks Steakhouse killing, along with 3 further Gambino associates named Robert Di Bernardo, Liborio Melito, and Louis De Bono, the very man Gotti had discussed on tape the previous December. Di Bernardo and Melito had both been killed years earlier in disputes that had nothing to do with federal investigators and everything to do with the same culture of internal suspicion that Gotti's own rule had intensified. Di Bernardo had been positioning himself as a candidate to succeed the murdered Frank DeCicco as underboss, a rivalry that pitted him against Angelo Ruggiero, and when Ruggiero accused DiBernardo of challenging Gotti's authority, Gotti ordered Gravano to have him killed, then promoted the more reliable Joseph Armoni to the underboss position instead. It was, in miniature, the same pattern that ran through Gotti's entire career. Any perceived threat to his authority, however minor, resolved through violence rather than negotiation, a habit that steadily thinned the ranks of his own inner circle even as it consolidated his personal control. The legal strategy behind that indictment marked a deliberate break from the approach that had failed twice before. Rather than charging Gotti with individual crimes one at a time, the way earlier prosecutions had, the government built its case under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a federal statute that allowed prosecutors to treat the Gambino family itself as a single ongoing criminal enterprise and to hold its leader responsible for the entire pattern of racketeering conducted through it, rather than requiring a jury to convict on any one isolated act that a clever defense attorney might manage to pick apart in isolation. It was, in effect, an attempt to try the whole organization at once, with Gotti sitting at the defense table as its embodiment. The case might still have collapsed the way the two prior prosecutions had, given the Gambino family's documented history of reaching jurors and intimidating witnesses, had it not been for a defection that no one inside the organization saw coming. Gravano, listening to additional wiretap recordings played for him by federal agents during pretrial proceedings, discovered that Gotti had been quietly describing him to others as a reckless, greedy killer acting largely on his own initiative, attempting, it appeared, to distance himself from responsibility for several of the murders by shifting the blame onto his own underboss. Whatever loyalty had bound the two men through years of shared crime dissolved the moment Gravano heard himself being sacrificed on tape by the man he had helped install as boss. On November 13th, 1991, Gravano formally agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, becoming the highest-ranking member of a New York crime family to turn government witness up to that point. The trial that followed in early 1992 was constructed from the beginning around a single lesson the government had learned from its previous failures. Nothing about this proceeding could be allowed to reach a juror or a witness before the verdict was in. Judge I. Leo Glasser approved an anonymous, fully sequestered jury, the first ever used in a Brooklyn federal case, citing the documented history of the PAP bribery scheme, prior witness intimidation, and ongoing concerns about Gotti's own brother, Peter's involvement in efforts to influence jurors. Jurors were identified only by number, rather than name, for the length of the proceeding, and were housed together for its entire duration, cut off from the kind of casual contact that had allowed the Gambino organization to reach earlier panels. Prosecutors also moved successfully to disqualify Bruce Cutler, the same attorney whose aggressive theatrics had helped win the 1987 acquittal, along with two other defense lawyers, on the grounds that all three had been captured discussing case matters on the very tapes the government intended to use as evidence, a ruling that stripped Gotti of the legal team, most responsible for his prior reputation as untouchable. When the trial opened on February 12th, prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason began not with witness testimony but with the tapes themselves, playing hours of Gotti's own recorded voice for the jury before a single cooperating witness ever took the stand. Jurors received written transcripts to follow along as the recordings played, profanity and all, while Judge Glasser reminded them that the audio itself, not the transcript, was the actual evidence before the court. It was, in its own way, the most complete reversal imaginable of everything that had made Gotti famous. The Dapper Don, who had spent years courting cameras on the courthouse steps, was now being convicted by his own recorded voice, played back to a jury that had never seen his face outside of a photograph and would never learn any of their own names to one another. Gravano testified over 9 days beginning in early March, describing the planning and execution of the Castellano murder in granular detail, down to where each conspirator stood on the sidewalk outside Sparks' Steakhouse, and what was said in the car afterward as he and Gotti drove past the bodies, and confessing to participation in 19 killings, across his own criminal career, a handful of which he directly implicated Gotti in ordering. He testified in the same flat, unemotional register throughout, delivering accounts of murder with the same tone he might have used to describe a shipping schedule, an affect that jurors and reporters alike found more unsettling than any display of remorse or bravado could have been. Under cross-examination from Gotti's attorney Albert Krieger and Locasio's attorney Anthony Cardinale, Gravano's account did not fracture. The defense attempted to portray him as a self-serving killer, trading testimony for freedom, and there was no shortage of truth in that portrayal, but neither attorney was able to shake the specific corroborated details of his account, especially once those details were measured against the recordings the jury had already heard in Gotti's own voice. Gotti, watching the destruction of his own legend unfold from the defense table, grew increasingly hostile as the trial progressed, at one point drawing a threat from Judge Glasser to have him physically removed from the courtroom, and referring to his former underboss as a junkie in an outburst over Gravano's past steroid use. On April 2, 1992, after only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Gotti on every count in the indictment. Locasio was convicted on all but one. Outside the courthouse, an assistant director in charge of the FBI's New York field office told reporters, in substance, that the Teflon reputation was finished, that the charges had finally held. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced Gotti and Locasio to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with a fine of $250,000 each. Gotti stood for the sentencing, much as he had conducted himself throughout the trial, defiant rather than contrite, offering no expression of remorse for crimes he had never once acknowledged committing, and reporters covering the proceeding noted that the man once famous for holding court on the courthouse steps had almost nothing to say once the verdict actually went against him. The reaction to the verdict extended well beyond the courthouse. Roughly 1,000 supporters had gathered outside the building at various points during the trial, a crowd that reflected just how thoroughly Gotti's public persona had taken hold of the popular imagination even as the evidence against him mounted. Within the underworld itself, the fallout was less sentimental. On Christmas Eve of that same year, a Queens couple named Thomas and Rosemary Uva, who had made a habit of robbing Mafia-owned social clubs, were shot to death in Ozone Park, a killing widely suspected to be connected to organized crime retaliation, though the man eventually charged in the case was acquitted at trial. The conviction that was supposed to end Gotti's story instead rippled outward into fresh violence in the same neighborhoods that had once celebrated his acquittals with fireworks. Gotti surrendered to federal custody that December and was transferred to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, where he was reportedly held in solitary confinement for 22 hours of each day, a level of isolation designed specifically to prevent him from continuing to direct the organization from behind bars. The isolation did not fully succeed, at least not immediately. Gotti attempted to maintain influence over Gambino family operations through his eldest son, John A. Gotti, who took up the role of acting boss during his father's imprisonment, but the effort collapsed under its own weight. In 1998, the younger Gotti was indicted on racketeering charges, and against his father's stated wishes, he pleaded guilty and accepted a 6-year sentence, rather than risk trial, with his son now also removed from the streets. Day-to-day authority over what remained of the family passed to Gotti's brother Peter, who would eventually rise to the position of boss in his own right, only to be convicted and imprisoned himself within a matter of years. Gravano's own path after the trial was hardly a quiet one, and it complicates any simple story about cooperation being rewarded with safety. Born in Brooklyn in 1945 and raised in Bensonhurst, he had entered the Witness Protection Program after a 1994 sentencing hearing at which prosecutors credited his cooperation with dozens of convictions across the Gambino hierarchy. But he disliked the constraints of the program almost immediately, and within roughly a year he had left it altogether, resettling openly in Arizona under his own name. He gave interviews. He appeared on national television, including a widely watched sit-down with journalist Diane Sawyer, in which he discussed the murders he had committed with the same flat composure that had unsettled jurors in Brooklyn. He published a best-selling account of his life with a journalist named Peter Moss, opened a restaurant, and started a swimming pool installation business in the Phoenix suburbs, building an entirely new public identity in a state that had no organized crime, history remotely resembling the one he had just walked away from. And then, in 2000, he was arrested along with members of his own family for running an ecstasy trafficking operation that authorities said was generating roughly $500,000 a week, a business he built in plain sight while living as a free man on the strength of the same instinct for profit that had made him one of the most valuable earners the Gambino family ever produced. He was sentenced to 20 years and released in 2017. The man who had brought down the Teflon Don never did learn to stay out of trouble on his own. That same year, doctors diagnosed John Gotti with throat cancer and transferred him to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where surgeons removed a tumor in a procedure that was, for a time, considered successful. The reprieve did not last. The cancer returned roughly 2 years later, and Gotti's condition deteriorated steadily from that point forward. He died on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, still a prisoner of the federal government that had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to convict him. The Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn declined to permit a full funeral mass inside a church, allowing only a memorial service after burial, and Gotti's funeral procession, when it came, was an almost defiant piece of theater in its own right. 19 flower cars, 22 black limousines, hundreds of private vehicles, and at least 4 television news helicopters, tracking the route as it wound through Howard Beach and Ozone Park, past the storefront that had once housed the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club before arriving at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, where Gotti was interred in a crypt beside the son he had lost to a neighbor's car more than 2 decades earlier. Notably absent from the entire procession were representatives from any of New York's other organized crime families, a silence that amounted, in the language of that world, to a public repudiation of everything Gotti's leadership had done to the business they all still depended on. A veteran organized crime journalist who had covered the family for decades offered what became one of the most frequently repeated assessments of Gotti's career in the days after his death, observing in substance that Gotti's true legacy was as a cautionary example, a demonstration to future mob leaders of exactly how not to run a criminal organization if staying out of prison was any part of the goal, since no one, in that journalist's estimation, could hope to run a secret society while treating Mulberry Street like a stage and inviting his own soldiers to line up for a weekly photograph. What his leadership had done, by the time he died, was leave the Gambino family in a state from which it would never fully recover, at least not as the dominant force it had been under Carlo Gambino and briefly and disastrously under Gotti himself. The prosecutions triggered by his own tapes and his own visibility rippled outward for years, and by the turn of the century, roughly half of the family's main members were, by law enforcement's own accounting, sitting in prison. The younger Gotti's legal troubles did not end with his release from his first sentence. Between 2004 and 2009, he stood trial 4 separate times on racketeering and eventually murder conspiracy charges, connected to an alleged plot against a radio host who had criticized his father on the air, and all 4 trials ended the same way, with juries unable to reach a verdict. During the final trial, prosecutors argued that his repeated claim to have left the Cosa Nostra behind in 1999 was simply untrue, while his own attorney countered that Gotti had privately told his imprisoned father during a visit to the penitentiary that he no longer had the stomach for that life. After the 4th hung jury, federal prosecutors finally declined to pursue a 5th trial, and the case against him was formally closed. Whether or not the younger Gotti had genuinely walked away from the family business, the pattern itself said something about how thoroughly the elder Gotti's tactics and the legal environment his own conviction had helped create had reshaped organized crime prosecutions for an entire following generation. Gotti's brother Peter, who had taken over day-to-day authority once both John and John's son were removed from the streets, eventually rose to boss in his own right, only to be indicted, convicted, and imprisoned himself within a few years, dying in custody in 2021 of natural causes. Leadership of what remained of the family passed eventually to a captain named Domenico Cefalù, reported to have taken over roughly a decade after Gotti's death, presiding over an organization that had learned, at enormous cost, to stop seeking headlines. As recently as 2019, a Gambino boss named Frank Colli was shot and killed outside his own home on Staten Island, the first killing of a sitting mob boss in New York in decades, a reminder that the family Gotti once ran had survived him, but had never fully escaped the instability his own leadership helped set in motion. A former underboss from a rival family would later summarize Gotti's career in blunt terms, describing his rise and fall as the beginning of the end for the entire structure of organized crime in New York as it had existed for generations. Whether or not that assessment overstates Gotti's individual importance, the pattern it describes is not seriously in dispute. The families that survived the following decades were, almost without exception, the ones that had learned to operate exactly as Gotti had refused to, quietly, anonymously, and without a single unnecessary word spoken anywhere a microphone might reasonably be expected to be hiding. The federal government's own strategy against organized crime shifted permanently in the years following Gotti's conviction, moving away from the theatrical, headline-driven prosecutions of the 1980s and toward the kind of patient, years-long electronic surveillance operations that had finally caught him, an approach that would go on to dismantle leadership after leadership across all five families over the following 2 decades, using the same basic method: find the room where the boss actually talks and wait. Gotti's fame outlived his freedom by a wide margin in a way that would have struck Carlo Gambino, the quiet, cautious boss whose name the family still carried, as almost incomprehensible. In the years following his conviction, Gotti was portrayed in television movies, theatrical films, and multiple documentary series, becoming, alongside Al Capone, one of the small handful of American organized crime figures whose face was as recognizable to the general public as to law enforcement. It was a strange, self-defeating kind of legacy for a man in his line of work, since the entire discipline of organized crime, as men like Carlo Gambino and later Vincent Gigante understood it, depended on the boss being the least recognizable person in any room he occupied. Gotti had inverted that principle so completely and so publicly that his own name eventually became a kind of shorthand for the very idea of the flamboyant, doomed mob boss, the cautionary example future organized crime figures were taught to avoid rather than emulate. Even federal agents who spent their careers chasing him would later admit, almost with a note of professional admiration, that Gotti had never once tried to disguise the fact that he considered himself exactly what he was, a boss who ran the largest Cosa Nostra family in the country in full public view, a stance no boss before him had ever dared to take and none after him would ever be foolish enough to repeat. There is a particular kind of irony embedded in the fact that the same underworld that produced John Gotti also produced men who understood, at a bone-deep level, exactly what he refused to accept. Elsewhere in New York during those same years, another boss was spending his evenings wandering the streets of his own neighborhood in a torn bathrobe, muttering incoherently, checking himself into psychiatric hospitals, building a documented medical record specifically so that no courtroom would ever be able to hold him accountable for anything, and that performance, sustained for decades, worked for far longer than anything Gotti built. The two men led the two largest crime families operating in New York City at exactly the same moment, and they represented, almost perfectly, the two opposite theories of how to survive in that world: total visibility or total concealment. Only one of those theories produced an organization that outlasted its leader's downfall, and only one of those bosses ever had to sit in a courtroom listening to a recording of his own voice describing a murder he had ordered, played back for a jury of strangers he would never be permitted to look in the eye. John Gotti did not lack discipline in every sense of the word. He commanded loyalty, ran a criminal enterprise worth many millions of dollars a year, survived at least one direct assassination attempt, aimed at ending his life before his reign, as boss had even properly begun, and outmaneuvered 3 separate prosecutions before the 4th one finally caught him. What he lacked was the specific, narrow discipline that every one of his own lieutenants had been taught to practice around him. The same discipline that had cost Willie Boy Johnson nothing when he kept his silence and cost him everything anyway. Once his exposure as an informant made him a liability regardless. The assumption that any room, no matter how private it felt, might already belong to someone else. Gotti preached that lesson for years, to captains lined up outside his club, to associates warned never to say too much on a telephone, to an entire organization drilled in the assumption that the government was always listening somewhere. He never once, apparently, believed the lesson applied to himself. The 600 hours of tape recorded in an apartment above what is today a shoe store, in a building that once housed the headquarters of the most powerful criminal organization in New York City, are the permanent record of exactly how wrong that belief turned out to be. They captured a boss announcing a murder before he committed it, naming his own successor before the government had even finished building its case, mocking his own underboss in terms that would eventually drive that underboss into a courtroom to testify against him, and warning his own men about the danger of being recorded in the very breath in which he was being recorded, doing precisely that. Nothing the government could have invented would have made a more complete or more damning portrait of a man convinced that the rules he enforced on everyone beneath him did not somehow apply to the man at the top. He built an empire on the principle that silence was survival. He lost it in the end to the sound of his own voice.